Well, I was born in the Bronx in New York City, and spent most of my youth growing up in the borough of the Bronx. And then, as a young teenager, of course, ventured into Manhattan and into a world of what I saw as great beauty, a city full of magnificent buildings, gorgeous buildings. And when I was a kid, I had an uncle who on Saturday afternoon, when I was quite young, used to like to show me the subway system, and we'd take the subway all over New York, mostly in Manhattan. But one of his interests was in construction for some reason, and so at that time in the early '50s, there was a lot of construction in New York, and so we go to these construction sites, and they had always had holes where people could look through. And so I had this memory as a young boy of experiencing all of this terrific construction that went on in New York through the early 1950s, mid and late 1950s, and I think it must have piqued my interest in architecture and building. I went through Catholic school in New York through high school, and as you know, I was a musician from the time I was at probably 9 or 10, and then took a break between high school and college, worked as a musician, worked with some amazing people, Etta James, Toots Thielman, and then began what I assumed was my secondary interest, which was architecture. And then went to Pratt Institute, where I received a Bachelor of Architecture degree, and then went on to graduate work at Harvard University, where I earned a Master of Architecture degree. Projects that I found intensely interesting, as I remember as a teenager, were projects like Rockefeller Center in New York, which were at that time barely 20 years old, relatively new in longevity of construction terms. And I was very taken by the magnificence of the design, the beauty, the inclusion of sculpture and ornament and all the decorative arts that were very much a part of this very modern complex. And of course, later on, I came to understand that Raymond Hood was, who designed the complex, was a quite tremendous talent in that regard, and started to see all of the buildings he did. The McGraw-Hill building on 42nd Street, the American Radiator building. They were really terrific projects that were very capable of being contemporary and modern, obviously being tall and making skyscrapers, but also being able to communicate with the rest of the architecture of the city across the history of New York's buildings. So it was those awakenings were both a product of design, obviously, and construction. But I was interested in the reality of building, and I was very interested in architecture's ability to transform pieces of the city. I had done a couple of interiors, but the first outside project was a store on Lexington Avenue, which was referred to me by another firm, and it was a very, very interesting experience because now I was on my own. There was no firm to cover, and there was a lot to figure out. I mean, there was a lot at that point to come to understand, because I was then responsible for all aspects of the project, unlike a bigger office where there's a project architect and other assistants. So you work on a big team of people. Here, this was a very small job, so I had to design it, do all the construction documents, do the supervision, and then and see what happened. So the awarenesses in the process were dramatic, because at some point we made the project. The client was very happy. They were two young guys who owned a clothing business on the Upper East Side. They were looking for something identifiable, something different, and the project that was delivered became an iconic piece of store design. It was published. It still gets published. It's more than 30 years old. It's unfortunately been demolished a year or two ago, but it was there for almost 30 years and was published all over the world, compared to Otto Wagner's Die Zeit Telegraph Shop and Hans Hollein's Schulien Jewelry Shop. So it became an iconic piece of design, but the which was quite surprising to me in the process. It was shocking because as the project was built in a shop on 19th Street, not too many blocks from here, and as it was being fabricated, it was made in big, rather large sections, and as I went to see it in the shop, I thought to myself, this is really doesn't look very good. It looked gargantuan and huge, but of course it was in a steel fabricator shop, so which was cramped and crowded, and I thought I made a terrible mistake. This was not going to go well. It was a career ender. It's going to hit the street, and that would be the end of it. And of course, the day they erected it on the site on Lexington Avenue, the whole thing shrank. It became perfectly situated into the landscape of Lexington Avenue, and it was an incredible learning experience to figure out what you were getting from the drawings and models that were being made, and ultimately the reality of the construction process and the construction on a particular site. So I got these unbelievable pictures. They were gorgeous photographs, and I had them reproduced, put them in plain manila envelopes, sent them to a bunch of magazines to publish, and the architecture magazines were ambivalent to say the least, but the interiors magazines went nuts, and so it wound up on the cover of Interior Design magazine in 1977, I think was the year, 76 or 77, and it wound up on the cover of the American Institute of Architects Journal, which was unbelievable. And then Domus published it, magazines from all over the world. It was in AD magazine in London, which was then one of the most well-known design magazines anywhere. And then I started getting teaching offers all over the place, and I had been teaching a little bit in New York, but because of the recession, I needed to pay my way, and work was few and far between. And at that point, Syracuse offered me a full-time job, and then exactly at the same time, Yale University. So it was a tough choice.
And how long were you at Yale for?
I was on the full-time faculty at Yale for 23 years until I left in 1999 to become Dean of the School of Architecture at City College. But then I started to work on I had traveled out to Michigan for a teachers conference at Cranbrook, and we were on a bus going on a field trip, and I passed this waterway in the middle of the landscape, this kind of canal that was running through the Michigan landscape, and it just struck me. And I remember I had a very old Canon camera. I put the lens out the window, I snapped a photograph of it, and for some reason it stuck, and I started working on a project for a house set in the landscape, set in the middle of this canal of water, this artificial waterway. And when I was a student, I had been very enamored with a lot of the castles and buildings in the Loire Valley, the Chenonceau, a lot of the castles in Wales, the Caerphilly Castle, all which were these combined beautiful manicured landscapes and buildings that were related or situated in the water. And so I started making these sketches and drawings, and a friend of mine in the music business said, there's a musician I know who's looking to build a house, and it turned out it was Ace Frehley of Kiss. And we wound up meeting, and I started working on this house for Ace Frehley. And when he saw it, he thought, "Oh, this is perfect." He said, I have this terrible problem where people figure out where I live, and then one morning I wake up and there's 100 people with their noses pressed onto my living room window. So he said, if I could be separated by something like water, that would be perfect. So we embarked on the house. We worked on it for quite a while. The house won one of the coveted Progressive Architecture Design Awards in 1980, I think. And the drawings of it, which were really beautiful set of color drawings, which were very unusual in the period, became world famous drawings. They've been in museum shows all over the world. They've been published in books on architectural drawing. The house never got built, but the drawings, the project itself, lived on for a very, very long time as a very well-known piece of theory in architecture at the end of the 1970s. These two projects, the store in Lexington Avenue and the Fraley House, because of what they pursued and because of what they were connected to in the relation to the history of the city of New York, and how I was beginning to understand putting new objects into the city, new buildings into the city, and because of the connection to the landscape in the Fraley House and what the house pursued as interior space, which was radically different from the work being done at the time, which was predominantly more corporate-looking Mesian glass architecture. This was a masonry block, all with color interiors, very vivid, different materials than were the typical material palettes of the day. These projects generated terrific interest, and they were very well published. People were talking about them. So one day, not long after the publication of the Fraley House, I got a phone call from a prospective client who had said he was looking for an architect to renovate a building up in Newport, Rhode Island that he had purchased, and was I interested in being considered? I said yes, and went for the interview, and it was William Boggs and his wife Greta, and as we began the interview, he told me this story, which I found both incredible but not unfamiliar, which was that he had another architect before, and Bill and Greta had this very excellent collection of antique 17th, 18th century antique furniture. And the architect who they were working with told them that they should take old furniture out in the yard and burn it. And I found this rather remarkable, but it also began to awaken in me the understanding that modern architecture had a very difficult part of its theoretical base that could not and would not assimilate itself into the history of either architecture or design and design artifacts, and in fact, if anything, believed that shouldn't exist at all. So this was a fascinating moment because of what I was interested in pursuing, and because fortunately they had the good sense to terminate their agreement with that architect and look for someone else. And after they interviewed, I think 5 or 6 firms, they called up and said, we'd like you to work on the project. We think you could do a great job. At that point, I'd only seen pictures. I rode up to Newport, Rhode Island, went to see the building for the very first time, the Callender School, which was a formidable and incredibly powerful and stately building in the Newport landscape. And it was both incredibly elegant, very beautiful, but it also had not fared well, having been unmaintained for quite a number of years. So there was a lot involved. The interiors were simple classrooms, not really distinguished. The entry hall had been renovated in the 1930s, so that was another distinctive piece of history. And the building had an interesting construction history, having been built in the original building, built in the mid-1860s, and then 20 years later an addition, making the building larger. And what that left was the residue of a series of structural anomalies on the second floor of the building, where they didn't bother to remove the structure of the original building. They simply left it and covered it over. All of this became a narrative and story about the building. So there was I was beginning to become very aware of the history of architecture and its impact on design, and its unfolding impact on how you could create a narrative and a story within the interior of this existing building that was far richer than the banal interiors that were being done at the time. Simply kind of Miesian, blank, vanilla space. I then sat down and talked with Bill and Greta about the program of the building, and Bill, obviously, other than including his collection of wonderful furniture, I had asked them what buildings they liked more than any others that they had seen, and they looked at each other and they said, "Well, we have two buildings that we greatly admire, that we've spent a fair amount of time in. One was the Isabella Gardner Museum in Boston, which I knew well because I had spent time in there as a graduate student. And the other was the Davanzetti Palace in Florence, which was a kind of magical interior and had a series of elements to them that eventually got incorporated into the calendar school." So with all of this information, and because the idea was not only was this a residence for them, but it was also they were going to build 5 other residences which would be sold openly. It was an idea to think about the collectivity of building a series of units inside this old building, what it meant to make a collective living experience, what it meant to do an apartment for an owner with a particular collection of artifacts. So there was a lot to think about, and it was clearly the biggest project I had done individually, but it was a absolutely magical experience because the existing building was terrific. The owner was very open to exploring I think what turned out to be, for me, a very important project with interesting ideas about interior space, furniture, incorporating history into the project. And of course, as with most projects, it had a challenging budget. So there was a lot to make work out, and it turned out to be quite a great experience. Of course, in the owner's apartment, that was one of the only apartments that faced both north and south, and so the color range is white on one side and gray on the other side. It has a crocus pink, purple color on the dining room facade with a dark blue, and then on the living room side it's a very, very aqua green filled with white. So the play between the two facades formed the architecture of the interior, and the color was the more decorative component, along with a lot of the shaping to the facades, the openings, the balconies, all of the other aspects to the design, which transformed the scale of this 30-foot high space into a very humane interior. It is the only apartment which has a double facade. It occupies the entire west portion of the building from north to south, and the piece that was built in the middle contains all of the private rooms of the apartment, the bathrooms, fireplace, sitting rooms, the kitchen, and the study on the 3rd floor. The 2 blue walls that form the actual privacy walls for the bedroom and the bathrooms and dining rooms go all the way up to the ceiling and connect to the outside wall, because we couldn't have removed everything. The building would have been structurally unstable. So those walls connect to the original structure, but then there's a second wall in front of them. There's a green wall in the living room, and there's the purple wall that contains the bridge balcony to the dressing room of the master bedroom. And it's an architectural design device which creates the illusion that this thing is floating in space, and because the cobalt blue wall is dark, it recedes greatly in behind the 2 brighter colors. So it creates the spatial illusion that this thing is untethered, but it's not. And then there's enough perforations and holes in it because we didn't have to completely connect it, it's opened at the top. There's openings into the bathroom you can see through from the master bedroom. So again, it creates this illusion, and it's separated by light strips on both sides, it's a spatial illusion that it's disconnected, but it actually is very much connected. Each piece of the building was basically colored and designed off the experience of seeing it when the building was uncovered. I wanted to change the way architecture was made, and especially interiors, and all of those things were relegated to a banality in modern architecture for the most part. And stairs for centuries had been the most elegant passages of going from space to space, or certainly from floor to floor. So part of the design of each of the units was to incorporate the stair as an active part of the design to explain the architecture as people experienced it. So I didn't want to just hide it behind the wall baffle. So when you come in, you look ahead, you see the beautiful living room, you saw all of this terrific collection of furniture, and then if your eye glanced up, you saw the underside of the stair going up from the second to the third floor. You could mentally construct a map. I was also very interested in the anonymity of modern architecture drove people crazy, and these geometric manipulations and things that people couldn't figure out. They didn't know where they were in buildings. One of the issues around the history of architecture is that architects took great pains to understand in the organization of space and architecture to explain to people subconsciously exactly where they were. So you could reconstruct the experience of moving from space to space, and you could understand that when you're in that stair, you had already experienced it from below as you came in, so you understood where you were in the composition of the apartment. In that unit, as you go up to the top of the stair, there's a tiny little square window. There's a place where you can sit on that stair and look out into the living room. So also part of it was about transforming the stair experience in not just the passageway, but also as another place to experience space and to have other places to sit and explore the way we live, the way you live in that apartment. I think maybe 6 months later, the project came to be finished. It looked gorgeous. We had it photographed. Next thing I know, I get a phone call from the editor of Architectural Digest, Paige Renz, who I didn't know. The magazine had been out a very short period of time before Newport. I don't remember the year it started, but they had not had an architecture section of the magazine at that time. It was strictly an interiors and decorating magazine, and Page was looking to expand, I think, the audience of the magazine, and they came up with this idea that they would have an architecture section to the magazine. So Bill, unbeknownst to me, had sent some of the photographs ahead to them, and they were wildly enthusiastic. So I'm having, this was a major piece of press, a major piece of publicity, and of course they had an exclusive on anything they published, so you couldn't show it anywhere else before they published it. So now I'd already been talking to the New York Times, I was already talking to other magazines. I had to stop all of that, and they of course wouldn't use my photographs. They had to send their own photographer. So they sent Nick Wheeler, who was a terrific, also a terrific photographer. I had George Cerna photograph it earlier, and then the biggest shock to this was that they had hired Paul Goldberger to write a review of the apartments. Paul at that point was, the leading architecture critic. He had taken over the Times Post from Ada Louise Huxtable some years before, and was the reigning architecture critic in the U.S. So this was major league. So a couple of weeks later, Paul Goldberger called me. We didn't know each other. Paul said, I've been asked by Digest. I'm fascinated by the project. They sent me some test photographs. I'm going to fly up to Newport and see it. I said, well, would you like to meet and have me explain the project? He said, absolutely not. I want to experience it on my own, and then perhaps afterward we'll get together and talk about it. So he went up. And a couple of weeks later, I got a phone call from him. He was totally taken aback by the project. He said he'd never seen anything like it. It was remarkable, and proceeded to write a rather extraordinary review in Architectural Digest about the building. It was slated to be on the cover of Architectural Digest. It was December, I think, of 1981, and it was bumped for the Reagan White House, unfortunately, but it did wind up on the cover of the Italian Architectural Digest, which ran it with posters all over Europe as advertising for the Italian Architectural Digest. It was then in multiple Architectural Digests. It's been in every magazine and book in architecture and interiors from Japan, Italy, Germany, everywhere, and it continues to be published, and was most recently included in a book on key interiors since 1790, published in London. So it was quite a stunning success at the end of the project. And the best of all was everybody enjoyed living in there, which was, of course, the most important aspect of the project. You know, it's been a fascinating study, because although the projects had tremendous success, they were never viewed as being in sync with what the reigning theory of architecture was. So here you have a project which is on the cover of Architectural Digest. It was world famous. Paul eventually included it in a piece he did in the New York Times on the home section. I was on the cover of the home section. Although it had that level of critical success, none of the architecture magazines would publish it, because it didn't fit in what was then the current theory of architecture. After all, it wasn't modern and skimpy and neutral. It wasn't historic, and it was, you know, it's been coined as somewhat postmodern, but it wasn't that either, because it didn't have the overt historic references that were part of that. So I think it was an uncomfortable place for where to find it, and of course I think it affected clients' ability to read through that. It took a very different person, as I've experienced it over my career, to see through all of that, to see through the stylistic things that were occurring in the profession, and to understand that the projects we were doing were really about something else. They were searching for a connection to history. They were certainly new and inventive, but it wasn't what was the current prospect. So at that time, the economy still was not great. It was the early 80s. But clearly there was a gearing up. There was going to be a bigger building boom, and I started entering competitions to try to look at projects that were much bigger in scale and scope. We entered the what became very famous competition, the Peak in Hong Kong, which was housing on Victoria's Peak in Hong Kong, and I did a project that was very much about being embedded in the landscape. It was a project that was very totemic in how it appeared in the architecture and the landscape of this hill and environment. It looked almost ancient when you saw it. We built a very beautiful model of the terrain, which had almost more than 100-foot change in grade across the length of the site, with all these towers, and we hid all of what were to be the club facilities. There was a very elaborate club component to the program. It was a very complicated, a complicated zoning problem that they had put forth in the brief. So, and we rendered it very much in very stark black and white, which was very different than certainly I had done in calendars, certainly different than I had done in the Fraley House. But I was looking to communicate something a little different in this project, and to really looked. I think there was the memory certainly of the Great Wall of China. There was the issue of this ancient landscape, and trying to get some sense of a connection to that legacy. And the jury were two very well-known, one Eastern, one Western architect. One didn't make it to the jury for some reason. And the next thing I know, Zaha Hadid won the competition. Of course, her career was pretty much made famous by that. But it was a very unbuildable architecture, and it was because the developer had no money and had no intention of, in fact, building the project. So when I ran into the one of the architects who was on the jury, who I knew from Yale, I said, I was struck. I said, did you actually see the project? He said, oh yes. He said, your project was remarkably visible. He said, but was seen as way too serious, and we were looking for Hollywood architecture, something that was kind of more frivolous, and of course there was the issue of the developer. The project was never built. Some years later, actually was doing research for a new book I have coming out on my work, and I went back to look at photographs for the site, and there was a housing project built. It looks remarkably like my Hong Kong project, startlingly so. In fact, if you overlay the two photographs, they're pretty identical. Well, there were a couple of tower projects. One was Stanley Tigerman's redoing of the Chicago Tribune competition in Chicago, and the second was the Times Tower competition. Right at that moment, the Municipal Art Society was very worried about Philip Johnson's master plan for Times Square, in which they were going to demolish all of the older buildings in Times Square. And I think there was a real fear that the character, the free-for-all character, the signs, the frenzy of that was going to be tamed and in fact expunged from New York City by these kind of bland corporate office buildings that were being scheduled for all of those blocks. So the Municipal Art Society held a competition. The Allied Chemical Building, which had replaced the New York Times building and the triangular site, which the ball drops from at the end of the year, had been left vacant. They had moved out of New York, and nobody knew what to do with the building. So the Municipal Art Society held a competition, an ideas competition for what to do with the building. So I was going through the area, looking around, and I was struck by, of course, at that point, the demolition of all of these magical Broadway theaters. And so I did it as a memoriam to the 7 theaters which had been demolished just prior to that year, and they were represented by 7 theaters embedded into the tower, including a theater in the round, which is the spherical theater in the lower part of the building, theaters which telescoped out of the top of the building, rehearsal rooms. It was kind of seen as a theater arts sanctuary. And the lower part of the building was connected into the subway. The legs of the building, the columnar structure, was to open the ground below, and so it would let light down into that very overly used subway stop. So it was an ideas competition, a way to look at tall buildings in Manhattan and see them as something other than corporate, as not being representational. I think the issue in all of my work has always been looking to find a representational component to the building. Right around the time that I became dean of City College, I got what to me was one of my most important commissions, and that was for the Saratoga Avenue Community Center. So I was hired by the New York City Housing Authority to build an addition to one of the existing housing projects in New York. This was a fascinating commission on several levels, one of which is at the level of urban design, to be able to look at these slab towers in the city which had left these wastelands of space around them. And although this was a very small building, I had the idea that I could use the building to transform this superblock idea into the way we made spaces in cities before, which were much more protected, much more enclosed, much more cared for in the way people came and left the buildings, in what they referenced to entrances, gardens, public spaces. The building was adjacent to a very large community park, a block away, a full city block, Saratoga Park. And so the backside of the building is a piece of the park which folds into the site, of which the building becomes the frontispiece or facade to that public space. On the opposite side of the building, the street side, it becomes a very secure place. The housing authority did not allow windows on the lower part of the building for obvious reasons in tough neighborhoods. So the windows had to be kept higher up, and there was an entry courtyard that you come through, that part which connects the building to the housing tower that's directly adjacent. On the day that the housing authority called me to tell me that I had the good fortune of designing a building for the housing authority, a young boy was shot and killed in a drive-by shooting on that site, sitting on the sidewalk exactly in the place where the building would eventually sit, which spoke a lot to me about the need to provide protection and some form of enclosure where families and kids could be in a much safer environment. So we embarked on the project. Of course, building anything for the government and the city is a very elaborate process. We had a great client, David Burney, who was then the director of design for the Housing Authority. As we presented the project to him, he at first point was a little skeptical that he could do all the things that we had described. As we eventually went into construction and the project was eventually built, because David was also an urbanist from London, was fascinated that such a small building could actually change an entire city block. It could actually transform the four quadrants of the site in such a dramatic way. And the building was also, I was very interested in making sure the building was seen as part of a legacy of public buildings. That meant it shouldn't look like a department store. It shouldn't look like a corporate office building. It shouldn't look like something light and frivolous. It should look serious. It should look like it was going to be there for a very long time. And it also fit my idea that this was a way to reconnect the building to the history of architecture, that for centuries architects worked in the same materials, the same language of architecture, and it certainly never inhibited anybody from inventing constantly within this landscape of buildings new and different structures, almost always made of brick or stone, especially in the Northeast where the winters are quite severe. That there was a way to approach that. I had also started teaching at City College and being dean of the school in 5 landmark buildings that I found affected me greatly. The George Post buildings for City College, which were dramatically beautiful, very powerful, rough and rugged, and were built with Manhattan schist, which is this very dark gray, almost black stone, but outlined with this white terracotta, very startling contrast in building form. And I found that the terracotta was a fascinating material in its malleability, its ability to make ornamental pieces. And I started to explore that in the architecture of the Saratoga Community Center. So, of course, we had an excruciating budget. It was painfully small. But I found by making substitutions in the way things were done at the Housing Authority before, that I actually could do a much more elaborate building for much less money. And so the building was able to have mahogany doors and windows. It was able to have it's an iron spot brick. It's not a particularly elaborate brick, but it's a beautiful brick. It has limestone. It has GFRC casting stone that makes all of the ornamental pieces of the cornice and the doorways and entryways and windows. So it provided a level of striking public architecture, the way public buildings had been made before.